Hi, I'm Scott Jensen, former Assembly Speaker,
And I'm Chuck Chvala, former Senate Majority Leader.
and we're the insiders. And in fact, we were the insiders 20 years ago when we were working on the redistricting issue here in Wisconsin. We had a Democratic state Senate led by Chuck and a Republican state Assembly, which I led. And we knew that we were not going to get to an answer, an agreement between the two of us on the maps, and it was going to be ending up being decided by the courts. And I think we were sort of at that position again. We have a Republican legislature, a Democratic governor. It's unlikely that they're going to agree on a map together. So off it goes to the courts. Who does that favor? Which party do you think is going to come out better in redistricting?
Well, by far, I think it favors the Democrats because the map that's in place right now was so partisan and drawn by the Republicans. I mean, Deerfield, where I lived from 1 year old till 4 years old, is in Dane County, in eastern Dane County, was linked up with Oconomowoc. I mean, come on, really? You had to jump all the way across Jefferson County to draw a map to steal some votes from the Democrats in Dane County? It's silly. But I do think that there is a good chance this time because one of the things that's important in redistricting, the reason we draw these maps is because the change in population. And where has that been? Almost all of the growth in the state, I shouldn't say almost all, but almost half of the growth in the state has been in Dane County. There will pick up at least an additional assembly district there. And the other growth areas are, of course, like suburban areas around Milwaukee, and that is tending to be more Democratic. So surprisingly, at least from the Republican standpoint, and given the maps that you see now, I think that is really quite easy to draw a map that will give Democrats a good opportunity, in fact, a better than 50-50 chance of getting a Democratic map and winning the state Senate. The Assembly is a little bit harder to draw, but I think the Assembly could have a decent shot. And I could see a court deciding that in a 50-50 state, you ought to draw maps that give people an opportunity to have that reflected in their legislative bodies. And especially after some of the things that the Republicans have pulled with their overabundance of majorities in both the Assembly and the Senate, I could see courts trying to do that to make sure that there's at least a better chance for better debate and for policies that reflect the purple state that we are. I think that also the Wisconsin Supreme Court, because Hagedorn has shown his independence, I think there's a good chance of getting a fair map drawn there. And the federal courts, I think, always try to draw it somewhat fairly. And Scott and I saw that actually in the 2000 election, after which we were able to pick up a seat in the following election. So remains to be seen, but I think that actually that was before the maps were redrawn. In 2000, we picked up an extra seat, but these were competitive seats all across even the 2000 2010, but they haven't been since Republicans drew the map 10 years ago.
Well, I think that you are correct that the maps that will come out of this process will be less favorable to the Republicans than the existing maps. That makes sense. The Republicans were able to draw the last maps with a free hand, with no review necessary by the courts because they held both the Assembly, the Senate, and the governor's post. But the maps are going to favor Republicans when they're done, not by as much as they are now, but the geographic distribution of voters across the state, with the Democrats tightly confined really in two counties, Dane and Milwaukee County, and most of the rest of the state favoring Republicans, means that geographically, if you follow the normal court precedents here of compactness and community of interest, you're going to end up with a map in both houses of the legislature that leans to the Republicans. It's not going to be a 50-50 map. There is no previous principle that courts have acknowledged that says the maps have to be competitive. If it's a 50-50 state, then you have to divide up the legislative seats between each party. That isn't a principle courts have used before. Democrats are trying to push that. But if the courts stick with the longstanding principles, they want communities of interest, people who are near each other, to be represented. They want the districts to be compact. And that's going to mean you're not going to be able to take votes in Dane County and run them deep into other places in the state in order to try to tip over seats for the Democrats just to become competitive at a statewide level. So I think overall, it's going to be not unlike 2000 when I chose as our strategy to just take what was a fair map and nudge it a little bit our direction. you were in a position where I think you were under attack. There was concern, the Senate had flipped back and forth between the parties several times. And the assembly was way out of reach. And so I think the Democratic strategy was to try to significantly improve your position, but I don't see how a court allows that to happen if they follow the rules that they've used in the past. So I think it's going to end up being a map that favors Republicans, but less so than the present maps.
I think the thing that we have to focus on here is where has the growth been and where has it not been? In the areas that have become the most dominant Republican areas in the rural parts of northern Wisconsin, those areas have actually shrunk. And in fact, the exceptions to those rules are around Democratic strongholds in the outlying parts of the state, like Eau Claire and La Crosse, and even in Green Bay. So what you're going to find is that the growth has been in Democratic areas, with the only exception perhaps being the Wall counties, but that has changed too, because more of those suburbs are going for Democrats. So I think what you're going to find is that the courts will be reluctant to do this just simply based on geography. And I think what they will recognize is that we have to reflect what's going on in our country and across the state, which is that what matters most is what political ideology people have. And I think you're going to see a court that's going to look at this somewhat differently than they have. Here's the other thing. Scott is absolutely correct that what both of us tried to do in 2000 was we tried to incrementally change the map. Why? Because the maps previous to us had been drawn by courts, and it would be hard to draw a really different map. That is entirely different this time, and a huge advantage to Democrats. There was a great partisan map drawing done by Republicans. I described one particular incident. But given that, the courts will see that going back to balance will require an equally dramatic change in the maps. That's going to help Democrats, as does where the population growth was. I think Scott underestimates the potential for drawing maps that will put Democrats in a very competitive position. In fact, I think more likely than not to win the state Senate, which I know best, and in a competitive situation with regard to the assembly. Acknowledging what Scott has said about, given the concentration of Democrats, it's harder to draw an assembly map that works.
Yeah, I can't imagine that happening, but we'll see. We'll see which court ends up deciding the matter, whether it's the state court, Supreme Court, or the U.S. Federal court system. But we'll know soon enough what the maps on each party's side will look like sometime later this fall, and sometime probably early next year. The courts will begin their work and decide what the districts are going to look like all across the state of Wisconsin for 2022.
See you next time.